Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining DataCon LA 2022. Welcome to the track Data Engineering. My name is Tanmay, and our co-host today is Riti. Please keep your phones on silent during the session, and don't hesitate to raise your hand if you have any questions. This session is currently streaming via Zoom and will be recorded. It will be available online in a few weeks. Today, we have our guest, Mr. Peter Zaitsev, and he will be talking about the title Key Open Source Databases Strategies that Shape Business in 2022. Peter Zaitsev is CEO and founder of Percona, and as one of the foremost experts on open source strategy and database optimization, Peter leveraged both his technical vision and entrepreneurial skills to show Percona from a 2% shop to one of the most respected open source companies in the business. Peter is the co-author of High Performance MySQL, Optimization, Backups, and Replication, one of the most popular books on MySQL performance. Peter frequently speaks as an expert lecturer at open source databases and related conferences. Without further ado, I'll hand this over to Peter and thank him for being here.
Okay, thank you.
You can start.
Mic working? Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. Yes, so we are going to talk about what's going on in the open source database space in 2022. So how many of you are using some open source database here? Oh, look at that, some brave souls. Good for you. Well, there is a lot of innovation going on with open source databases those days, which is, I think, quite cool. I've been in this business for a while. What the fuck? They're not. Interesting. So we did not connect them properly. Or maybe technology is complicated. I so much like when we can just use the PowerPoint, but it wasn't invented here. Oh, now it works together. That's better. So the first thing what is interesting in the last few years is there is a lot of focus on distributed databases, right? If you look at 20, 25 years ago, a lot of databases were built as a single server database first and foremost, right? And not just open source. Like if you think about the Oracle, that started as single server database. Same goes for MySQL or Postgres. Those days, because we are working with a massive amounts of data, because of the requirements of the cloud native technologies, right? We are really building the databases which are distributed from day one. The second interesting trend from technology standpoint is a separation of storage and compute. Right? Again, they're in a, let me call it like a classical old approach to a database. You have a server, right? And it kind of both has a storage attached to that some way and kind of compute processing power in there. And if you need more processing, you may have multiple of the same those servers, right? So you cannot really scale storage and compute independently, and that gets to us to another interesting approach that a lot of new database technologies exploring, or at least providing like an option, is the serverless. Right. Well, serverless, of course, doesn't mean there are no servers, right? There are servers which run somewhere and somebody is managing those for you, but then you as a user, as developer, do not have to think about provisioning servers, right? You can just, control maybe performance parameters, right? Or something else, right? And let me, okay. We have, in this case, couple of different changes, right, which are also open source databases are changing in the data model standpoint, right? If you look at over last decades, we had a lot of focus on relational databases, right? That was if you think, 15 years ago or so, right? That was the only game in town. Now there is a lot of innovation going on in this space, right? We have, for example, time series databases, right? A lot of database technologies in that space, right? Well, because we have a lot of data coming in, right? Which is some kind of time series. There are graph databases, document databases. There are some other databases as well. You also look at their multimodal databases. These are the databases which support different models at the same time, right? And that is, I think, the way how you can often see their the ideas sort of like a cross-pollinating. If you think, for example, at the relational database technologies, right, all of them have been getting at least some JSON support. Some of them are also getting some additional ways to interface with database in non-relational way, such as MySQL, doc store, for example. You also have an interesting trend. What some databases, for convenience purposes, may support multiple protocols, right, for clients, either as an extensions or some of it as a core. So, for example, pretty popular open source column store database called ClickHouse. It has its own native protocol, but also it can talk Postgres and MySQL protocol, right? Very convenient. Another database, Victoria Metrics, it has InfluxDB or Graphite APIs if you want to get your data in. FerretDB, they are working on being able to use PostgreSQL backend with MongoDB frontend, right? Or another interesting extension, Babelfish, joins the same PostgreSQL in Microsoft SQL comparable database, right? And I think what is interesting in this case, you may find a lot of focus specifically on Postgres, right? Which is really have a lot of growth those days, and I think a lot of that connected not only to what like a PostgreSQL is a great technology, but also because that is really their permissively licensed and sort of community governed database technology, right? And that means a lot of people can build business on it, right? Contrary to something like MySQL or MongoDB or Elastic, where you tend to have like only kind of one vendor, right, who is kind of posed to take their largest benefit of that community. So what is the biggest factor which impacts, oh, for some reason it doesn't, okay. A second, okay. Yeah, so what is the biggest factor what impacting the open source now, if you ask me? And from my standpoint, that is the cloud, right? I mean, the cloud, of course, is not new, right? But I think those kind of process, how exactly the open source and cloud are going to play together, that is still something which is being evolved. I think what is interesting with that cloud is what you will see what their database technology of the year by DB Engine was Snowflake, right, in 2021. I think that was quite a while since we get non-open source and especially kind of cloud-based technology as showing the biggest growth in the year. Now, I think cloud impacts open source in quite an interesting way. From one standpoint, it really is very helpful for open source projects to maximize adoption and make adoption more simple, right? You can shrink wrap some complicated open source technology and make it available in the cloud in a couple of clicks. But at the same time, that also changes who gets the money, right? If you think about example of the MySQL, it's probably not a secret what even if Oracle does most of MySQL developer, it is Amazon which makes most money in their MySQL ecosystem by pretty much shrink wrapping MySQL and making that available available on the cloud. On the other hand, as example of maximizing adoption, I would mention Postgres. Postgres for years was loved by developers on one side, but it was kind of relatively tricky to operate, right? But well, guess what? If you have PostgreSQL in the cloud and it is Amazon's problem, right, or Google's problem of operating that, then you don't really care to what extent PostgreSQL is more or less tricky to operate than MySQL. Now, one person I like to quote, well, maybe because that was sort of like the CEO of one of the first companies I worked for, MySQL AV, he was always telling us what the open source itself is not really the business model, right? You can think about open source as a development model, as a distribution model, but itself, it's not a business model. The open source can empower many different open source business models, and the cloud changes which of them are playing better or worse. For example, cloud really hijacked all that GPL-based business model, right? In the past, some companies, and MySQL, one of them, was saying, well, you know what? If you just build your software as an open source, you can use MySQL for free. If you want to build in MySQL in some sort of proprietary software, well, you'll have to buy a commercial license for us. Well, because GPL would forbid this kind of process. In the cloud, that no more applies because there is no distribution happening in the cloud, right? For example, Amazon does not distribute the software, right? It provides the software as a service, so GPL restrictions does not apply, and that means Amazon can have modified, monetize modified MySQL version without paying Oracle anything. In this case, I think it's interesting to look at two different kinds of open source software which exist based on governance, right? We have a foundation-driven open source, as well as a single vendor-driven, and they generally have a relationship with the cloud thought of a very different way. If you look at the foundation-based open source, right? Like, so you can think about Apache Foundation, Cloud Native Foundation, Postgres is a very good example. They really rather happy about what's going on in the cloud because that really gets adoption. If you think about PostgreSQL community out there, like they are saying, well, that is fantastic what the Postgres is available on every cloud out there. Yes, it kind of changes who captures the value, but you know what? When PostgreSQL community was mostly sponsored by Enterprise DB in the past, and now it's more sponsored by Google and Amazon, well, that is not a problem because if anything, it actually gets more resources overall. That is very different if you think about the single vendor companies, because in those cases you can see about the companies which are venture funded or public companies which are very much dislike what clouds compete with them, right? Often their pitches, their business models, wherever they are designed for capturing their majority of the value from their open source project, right? And a business they create about that, right? And cloud looking to get a like chunk of that is not appreciated. And what that has been causing in the last few years, you can see many companies fully or partly abandoning open source licenses, right? These are some of examples here, right? And often you would see sort of a new class of licenses which would be the source available licenses, which says, well, you know what, you can see the source code, you may be able to do something with it, but you do not get the full set of rights what you are expected to get with open source software. Now, if you think about the primary goal of a license change for those things, is really it's about creating monopoly in a database as a service market, right? And why is that? Well, because if you think about the database space, database management is kind of rather messy, complicated. There is a high risks if you screw something up, right? Because, well, if you have screwed up something with applications, you often can just roll back your code and launch your old version. If you screwed up your database, well, you screwed up your database, right? Often there is no recovery for that, especially if you screwed up your backups along the way, right? So that is what makes database as a service is very, very valuable. And the primary focus of a license change is creating monopoly for those vendors in a database as a service. Now, what makes a database as a service so wonderful? Well, if you think about simplicity of using and deploying databases, database as a service, that is it, right? Any other kind of, let's say, installing software, managing that is a lot more complicated, right? It provides a high level of automation, and it also allows their developers to focus actually on application development and instead of like all that, potentially messy and complicated database management problems. So what do you see? I see as a problem with this monopoly in a database as a service space. Well, the problem in this case is what that really becomes no different than proprietary software, right? Oracle, DB2, you name it. And yes, you can say, well, but you know what, you can, of course, just go ahead and compile the database from a source, right? And if you want to kind of run it and not use database as service. But for many organization teams, that is not really practical, right? Because such a huge different level of skills required for running database as a service and rolling out your own comparable solution. Now, I think though is for open source, not really all is lost. And if anything, we can take a look at some history here. I remember I started using open source in late 90s, early 2000s, right? And I remember at that time, if you really wanted to have like this kind of very productive development stack, well, Microsoft was it, right? They would use sort of like a well-integrated, polished solutions compared to we would, write PHP code in BI, right? Or something like that. And I feel there is some of that going on right now, right? We have a very polished, convenient, seductive, and proprietary stack, which Amazon and other vendors provide us. If you want more examples, Linux and Solaris would be one. I remember in my early career, when I was telling folks, well, we are using Linux for our applications, they would say, well, but that is like a toy operating system. It cannot support files more than 2 GB in size. And you know what? 32 bits operating system, well, that a joke? Well, now a bunch of years later, I think there is Linux, there is Solaris, right, and which is kind of handling more of workloads, including mission critical ones. So I believe that is what's going. Oh, for some reason it didn't transition sometimes here. Okay. Yes, I am kind of sorry we have some funny technical difficulties here, which also gets me off my train of thought. So if I'm sometimes not making sense when I speak, then that's fine. You know, we can blame and should blame those guys and girls in yellow shirts. Okay. But anyway, so we have open source, which I believe is catching up again. Specifically, I'm very excited about the work that Cloud Native Computing Foundation is doing, right? We really do have a lot of solutions right now for pretty much majority of functionality what AWS services can provide. Now, in many cases, that is not as robust yet, not as polished, right? And obviously it will take a time here, but for more and more solutions, we do have, for more and more problems, we have feasible open source solutions available. And what is interesting here is it actually brings us to this, right? This is something which I took from their Amazon presentation slides, you know, decade or more ago. You see there's like some old logo from Amazon, and they have been explaining cloud, saying, well, cloud is like electricity. It does make sense for most of us to, you know, to run our own generators, right, and create our own electricity. You just better have it as a utility. Well, this is of course all well and good, right, and we should follow Amazon advice, but guess what? Electricity is commodity. No matter what you buy, electricity, it is the same. You don't have to change your TV or fridge or microwave if you are changing your provider. And that is, I think, how you can and should build your infrastructure in the cloud. You can use a lot of the modern clouds as commodity, which is very, very convenient, gives you a lot of agility, but not go into their proprietary, highly locked-in solutions. So as I mentioned, database as a service is all what matters. So is that something what we have working for us right now? Well, and the answer is, well, not quite yet, but there are some steps, maybe baby steps, which are being done in this direction. And let's look at what's going on in the open source space in this direction. The first important component is Kubernetes. Right? You can think about the Kubernetes as an operating system, but for your data center rather than or for a single computer, right, as Linux has been. I know that is not completely exact abstraction, but I think that's close enough. And what is great about Kubernetes is what it is universally available. It's available in the cloud, on-prem, on the edge. You see even the almighty AWS, right, when they still started to have their own container engine, kind of had to give up and provide the managed Kubernetes service those days. And Kubernetes is getting a lot better for stateful applications. Initially, Kubernetes was designed also for stateless applications, right? So not used well for databases, but right now it has much better infrastructure for doing that, and specifically with a technology called Kubernetes Operators. What is cool about Kubernetes Operators? Well, Kubernetes Operators, as the name says, right, they can emulate a lot of functions what your human operator would do, which corresponds to both day one, which means kind of your deployment, as well as day two, which is kind of much more sort of complicated and messy things like, self-healing, upgrades, scaling infrastructure, right? Operators can really automate a lot of that. Now, the downside of a Kubernetes, if you will, is what they Kubernetes operators is what they do require some knowledge of how Kubernetes works, right? UX is Kubernetes specific. It's not similar to something like RDS where you can just deploy a database in 2 clicks. Now, if you know what some about the Kubernetes, I would suggest you to check out this article, which kind of shows what you can do with database the operators. There is a number of articles out there, but this one is written by me, so I'm kind of biased. Okay. Oh fuck, we again did not. Let's see. So what is it? Yes, Kubernetes, data automation, and that is a link of an article. Folks, you got to tell me, say, Peter, you fucked up the slides again. Look, we're all friends here. I mean, that's what would make it easier for all of us. Okay, yes, so that is a link to that wonderful article I have written. Okay, yes, how we can build database as a service on Kubernetes, and can we do that? Well, the first interesting for me is that there is actually a lot of database as a service right now, right? These are some of the names, right? The companies which provide you operator database as a service experience, right? But in the end, it is built using Kubernetes on the backend, right? So what that tells me is, well, that is feasible and well tested. Collectively, I think all of those new generation database as a service software probably running in tens of thousands of instances powered by Kubernetes, right? So it can be done. Yes, that requires you to set up Kubernetes in appropriate way for performance, robustness, and so on and so forth. In Percona, though, we are also working at a fully open source solution for database as a service as part of our Percona monitoring and management tool, right? And I do not expect we will be the only one in this regard, right? As usually, then you have a lot of proprietary solutions for certain problem area. Typically, there is number of open source solutions come up in due time, right? After it has been proven industry that is a way to go, right? And there is, so much demand out there what that creates a good reason. It is currently work in progress, so you can think it's better or experimental way, but hey, that is open source. I would encourage you to check it out, what we've been doing, provide your feedback, or maybe even submit some code. That is how we push their open source forward. I truly believe that is something which can be done and will be done in due time. There is a lot of remaining potential for open source technologies, right, including that space of the competition in the cloud. Right now, I think what we are working on, a lot of that goes in their space of usability, if you like. And this is kind of often have been a little bit harder for open source ecosystem, right? I think there is a lot more people saying, hey, I want to work on the hard problems, like a performance or some, complicated distributed systems problems. That is all cool. Making sure it is very, very easy often has been harder, but I think a lot of a new generation open source, you can see, has been working in this environment as well. Now, what I think is interesting also there, when I would maybe do a little bit of plug for Percona, is what we are the company which produce all the software as an open source, right? We don't do open core, source available, right, or anything else, right? All software we ship to the customers is open source. And for many years, right, and probably like since day one, I said, hey, you know what, that is not possible. You wouldn't be able to sell it or whatever. But reality is, it works, and it works pretty well for us, because reality is what, if you look at the enterprises, they do not want to do it alone. Even if all source code is found on the on a GitHub because of a lot of well, their own reasons, they would much rather work with you, you know, with your support, have somebody to blame, have somebody to be, you know, responsible for supply chain security, somebody to be, you know, scapegoated if need to be, right? So that is possible. And yes, well, that talks about 15 years, but actually it's August already, and we just celebrated our 16 years anniversary, and that is my co-founder Vadim. Yes, and you can see he is very comfortable wearing tiara. With our kind of Zoom call with our team. Well, that's all I had, and if you have some questions, I would be happy to answer those. No questions? Comments? Oh, okay.
What are some of the biggest industries that you're working with, or some of the industries more open to the open source?
Yes, well, for us right now, we are working with a lot of industries. You think like, you know, healthcare, e-commerce, financial industry, and so on and so forth, right? And I think here it's not just like an opens to being open to open source, but it's also some of, I would say, like a resistance to the cloud. And that also have some, you know, geographical, you know, component to that, right? Where not everybody may be allowed to be in the cloud, right? Especially in the American cloud, right, if you will. And for us, we see cases like, for example, with MongoDB, they're pushing a lot of people right now. Hey, you know, MongoDB Atlas is the only way, right? Which is not a great solution for some, for many large enterprises, right? Which have been recently coming to us. But yeah, I would say that is often larger enterprises, because that is this kind of question of a lock-in, right? Many enterprises who have been there before, right, and who played with Oracle and a while back, they understand where all the thing goes, right? In terms of, well, once you get yourself to be locked in, sooner or later, you will be helping other company to meet their revenue goals at the expense of you meeting your profitability goals, right? So they are much more open to that, much more thinking about that, right? If you think about like a smaller startups, you know, look, for them, often it doesn't really matter how much you spend on, you know, spend a little bit more on Amazon, right, or on your data house. Who cares? There is a lot more other reasons to die, right, than a little bit of that spend. So, yeah, that's how I say it.
More hybrid cloud. Definitely someone to blame is very important. So they'll use something like OpenShift, so they can blame Red Hat instead of having developers on that. That's what I work with enterprise.
Yep. That is a good point. Okay. Other thoughts, questions? Anybody else? Yes, okay.
I'm using Percona server for one of the check dates appears on it. Thank you for that. Great product. Anyway, so you said you go to, you build up a cloud business or the DB service?
What's it?
You build up the DB as a service on your own, or you just help customers to go to?
No, so if you look at this case, right? So what we are looking first and foremost, a lot of companies, especially like in the enterprise space, a lot of them like the concept of database as a service, like self-service and so on and so forth, right? But they want that private, same as a kind of private cloud, right? And a lot of them have been building that using our technologies, right? So what we are having right now with PMM and all that functionality is to really have a complete product, right? So that provides full experience of that backed up by the Kubernetes, right? And that's currently in a preview. Okay, anybody else? Well, in this case, so thank you for coming. I hope you learned something new.